precision, detailing a financial transaction between her family and the Harringtons. What her father had once believed to be a fair deal was, in truth, a scheme. The Harringtons had taken advantage of his financial ruin, exploiting his vulnerability to seize Willowbrook. A knock on the door startled her, pulling her from the storm of her thoughts. "Eliza, are you all right?" The soft voice of one of the maids drifted through the door. "I'm fine," Eliza replied, her voice tight. "I just need some air." Without waiting for a response, she swept from the room, the letter crumpled in her hand. Her mind raced as she descended the narrow staircase and crossed the long halls of the estate. Each step echoed with memories of her childhood, moments once filled with laughter and warmth, now replaced by a cold bitterness that gnawed at her heart. She found Thomas Harrington in the drawing room, standing by the window, his posture as rigid as his expression. He didn't turn as she approached, his gaze fixed on the mist rolling over the fields. The room was silent, but for the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth. Eliza stood in the doorway, clutching the letter in her fist, the weight of the confrontation pressing down on her. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Could she face him with all the fury that churned inside her? Could she demand answers from the man who had, without knowing it, stolen everything from her? But then her anger surged and the hesitation vanished. "Thomas," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. He turned, his expression cool, but his eyes flickered with surprise at her tone. "Eliza, is something the matter?" She crossed the room in swift strides and threw the crumpled letter onto the table between them. "Is this your idea of justice? Is this how the Harringtons rise in society? By exploiting those beneath them?" His brow furrowed as he glanced at the letter. "What are you talking about?" Eliza's voice trembled with barely contained rage. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. My father, he trusted your family. He believed he was making a deal to save our estate, to save Willowbrook. But it was nothing more than a betrayal, wasn't it? A way for your father to take everything from mine when he was at his weakest." Thomas picked up the letter and began to read, his face remaining impassive, though Eliza could see the tension tightening in his jaw. When he looked back at her, his expression was unreadable. "Eliza, Don't you dare," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "Don't stand there and pretend you didn't know." "I didn't," Thomas replied quietly, the firelight casting shadows across his features. "I knew nothing of this." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "How convenient for you. You get to live in this grand estate, reap the benefits of my family's ruin while claiming innocence." "Do you think I wanted this?" Thomas's voice rose, his usual calm demeanor fracturing under the weight of her accusations. "Do you think I asked for this legacy? To inherit not just the land, but the sins of my father?" Eliza took a step back, startled by the raw emotion in his voice. Thomas rarely allowed his feelings to surface, always hiding behind a mask of cold indifference. But now his eyes burned with something she hadn't expected: guilt. "I didn't know," he continued, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "I wasn't part of those decisions. I was just a boy when your father lost Willowbrook. But I've spent every day since trying to uphold this estate, trying to make something good of it despite how it came to us." She stared at him, her anger wavering, replaced by a confusion she hadn't anticipated. "Then why didn't you say anything? Why let me believe you were part of this theft?" "Because I thought it would be easier," Thomas admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Easier to let you hate me for what my family did than to explain the truth. I didn't think you would ever understand." Silence hung heavy between them, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. Eliza clenched her fists, the letter crumpling further in her hand. "You had no right to decide what I would understand. My family, my father, died believing he had failed us, failed me. And now I find out it was all a lie." "I know," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry." The apology hung in the air, and for a moment, Eliza didn't know what to do with it. Could she accept it? Could she allow herself to forgive the man standing before her, the man whose family had taken everything from her? She turned away, unable to look at him any longer. Her heart ached with the weight of her memories, of the love she'd once had for Willowbrook, now tainted by betrayal. But as she stood there, staring at the familiar room that had once been her home, she realized that it wasn't just Willowbrook she was grieving for. It was the life she could never have, the person she could never be again. "I can't stay here," she said quietly, her voice trembling with the effort to hold back tears. "Not after this." Thomas took a step toward her, his expression pained. "Eliza, please, don't leave like this." "I have to," she whispered. "I can't forgive you. Not yet." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Thomas standing in the shadows of Willowbrook, his hand still gripping the letter, his apology unanswered. Chapter 7. A Departure of Hearts. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Willowbrook Manor, casting soft golden rays onto the grand entrance hall. Dust motes floated in the air like tiny memories suspended in time, reminders of a past Eliza Carter was now desperate to leave behind. Her fingers trembled as she tied the final ribbon around her modest trunk, the only possession she could truly call her own. Her heart was heavier than the bag she packed, weighed down by the tangled web of emotions she hadn't anticipated when she first set foot on the grounds of her childhood home. She paused by the window overlooking the sprawling gardens, her eyes lingering on the distant silhouette of the willow tree by the river. It was there she had spent countless hours as a child, dreaming beneath its graceful branches, unaware of how fragile those dreams would one day become. The willow had been her sanctuary then, a place where she had felt free from the world's judgments. Now it stood as a silent witness to her sorrow, an emblem of all she was leaving behind. "Eliza, are you sure?" Mrs. Hampton, the housekeeper, stood by the door, her weathered face etched with concern. "You don't have to leave so abruptly." Eliza forced a small smile, though it did nothing to hide the storm of emotions churning inside her. "I'm afraid I must, Mrs. Hampton. It's time." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but they were necessary. Staying at Willowbrook had become unbearable, the ghosts of her past whispered too loudly, and her feelings for Thomas Harrington had only complicated her desire for a clean break. She had come to Willowbrook seeking stability and found instead an emotional upheaval she could no longer control. Mrs. Hampton gave her a sad nod, stepping aside to allow Eliza to descend the grand staircase one last time. Each step echoed in the hollow space, the sound a reminder of how empty the house felt, despite its grandiosity. At the bottom of the stairs, Thomas Harrington waited. His presence was both expected and dreaded. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as her eyes met his. Those same dark, penetrating eyes that had seen straight through her defenses time and again. Today, however, they held something different. The confidence that usually defined him had faltered, replaced with a quiet, almost painful vulnerability. It was the look of a man who had finally realized what he stood to lose. Leaving without saying goodbye? His voice was soft, yet the words held a weight that threatened to crush her resolve. Eliza straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to meet his gaze evenly. "I thought it would be easier that way." "For whom?" he asked, stepping closer, his presence like gravity pulling her toward him, even as she fought to maintain her distance. "For both of us," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "There's nothing left for me here, Thomas. Staying would only prolong the inevitable." He stood there, silent for a moment, his jaw clenched as if wrestling with words he couldn't quite bring himself to say. Eliza could see the struggle in him, the war between pride and something far more dangerous, vulnerability. "You can't mean that," he said at last, the words carrying a hint of desperation he couldn't mask. "You and I, there's something here, Eliza. You know it as well as I do." Eliza's heart twisted painfully in her chest. Of course she knew. She had felt it in every glance, every accidental touch, every conversation where their words had danced around the truth. But knowing it didn't make it easier. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. "It doesn't change the past, Thomas. It doesn't change what happened to my family or what your family did. No matter how much I might care for you, those truths remain." His expression darkened, the mention of their families driving a wedge between them once more. "My father's sins are not mine to bear," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "I never wanted any of this legacy, this estate, and yet it is mine to carry. But Eliza, He faltered, and Eliza could see the moment when his carefully constructed walls began to crack. "I can't let you leave like this." She felt the tears prickling at the edges of her eyes, but she blinked them away, determined not to break down in front of him. "Thomas, don't," she whispered. "Please don't make this harder than it already is." His hand reached out as if to touch her, but then stopped short, hovering in the space between them. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. But then, with a heavy sigh, Thomas let his arm drop to his side, the gesture of defeat echoing in the silence. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't change the past, and maybe I don't deserve a future with you after everything that's happened, but I need you to know something before you go." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, every fibre of her being screaming at her to leave, to walk away, before he said something that would make her doubt her decision even more. But she couldn't move. She stood rooted to the spot, waiting for the words she knew would break her. "I love you, Eliza," Thomas said, the words heavy with sincerity and a depth of emotion that left no room for doubt. "I didn't realize it until it was too late, but I love you. And no matter what happens after today, that will never change." The silence that followed was deafening. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, her chest tightening with the weight of his confession. She had dreamed of hearing those words, but now, in the cold light of reality, they felt like a cruel joke. She took a step back, her voice barely audible as she forced herself to respond. "Thomas, But she couldn't say it. The words lodged in her throat, refusing to come out. She couldn't admit what she felt, not now, not when leaving was the only way to protect her heart from shattering completely. Instead, she turned away, her steps quick and decisive as she headed for the door. Behind her, she heard Thomas's sharp intake of breath, but he didn't follow. He let her go. As Eliza crossed the threshold of Willowbrook Manor, a single tear slipped down her cheek, and with it, the last fragile hope she had held onto for something more. She stepped into the waiting carriage, the sound of the wheels on the gravel path, a hollow echo in the quiet morning. And just like that, Eliza Carter left the only place she had ever called home, leaving behind not only Willowbrook, but the man who had unexpectedly claimed her heart. Chapter 8. A Love Unspoken. The rolling hills of the countryside stretched endlessly beneath the golden light of a fading afternoon, yet Eliza felt no peace. The landscape, with its tranquil meadows and distant river, seemed indifferent to the storm swirling inside her heart. She had left Willowbrook behind her, its looming walls, its memories, and most importantly, the man who had begun to take root in her soul like ivy climbing the old stone walls of the manor. Seated by the window of the modest inn where she had taken temporary refuge, Eliza stared out at the far horizon, her mind wandering back to the dance, to the confrontations, and, above all, to Thomas. His face, usually so controlled and impassive, had been unmasked in those last moments before she left. His voice, low and rich, had echoed in her ears as he admitted feelings he'd barely managed to express. "I cannot ask you to stay," he had said. The words had been both a plea and a surrender. He had not asked, but the pain in his eyes had been impossible to ignore. Now, miles away from Willowbrook, she was haunted by his unspoken wish, by the way his hand had lingered just a moment too long when he handed her that letter of recommendation, fingers brushing hers as if some part of him could not let go. She had made the right decision, hadn't she? Eliza told herself this again, though the conviction no longer sat easily in her chest. Leaving was meant to be her liberation, an escape from the tangled history of the estate and the growing confusion in her heart. Thomas Harrington was everything she had been taught to despise. Privileged, proud, and a symbol of the very world that had destroyed her family. Yet, every memory of him now seemed laced with something more, something fragile, something tender that she had not expected. The dance of memories. The inn-room felt suffocating despite its simplicity, so Eliza rose and pushed the window open, letting the evening breeze kiss her flushed cheeks. Her gaze drifted upward to the first stars appearing in the dusk-lit sky. It had been under those same stars that she and Thomas had danced. She could still feel the weight of his hand at her back, the way his fingers had settled at her waist with a touch that had felt at once possessive and reverent. His dark eyes had searched hers as if he was waiting for something, waiting for her to forgive him, perhaps, or to admit the truth that both of them had avoided. But instead of words, there had been only that charged silence, filled with the unspoken desires and doubts neither of them could voice. "I hate him," Eliza whispered to herself, but the words tasted bitter, like a lie. She had hated him once, hated what he represented, what his family had done. But now, as she stood there, miles away from him, all she could feel was an aching void where that hatred had once burned. She pressed her hands to the windowsill, the wood rough beneath her palms, and tried to steady her breath. She should be relieved, free. But instead, her mind turned to the softness in his voice when he had admitted his guilt about Willowbrook, to the vulnerability he had revealed only to her, and to the gentleness that had lived behind the harshness of his exterior. A battle between head and heart. "Why am I thinking of him still?" Eliza murmured, her voice barely audible above the whisper of the wind. It was not just the history of Willowbrook that had kept them apart. It was the history in her own heart. She had carried the weight of her family's ruin like a shield, letting it guard her from any true connection, from any possibility of forgiving those she held responsible. But Thomas had broken through that wall without even realizing it. Her heart ached with the memory of the way he had looked at her that final night. There had been something in his gaze, something that spoke of longing and regret, of a life not dictated by duty and legacy, but by emotion, by desire. It was the same desire that had stirred within her, try as she might to deny it. But what could she do now? She had left, and he had let her go. They were both too proud, too wounded by the past to say the words that might have kept her at Willowbrook. Her thoughts drifted to the willow tree by the river, the place that had been hers long before Thomas had entered her life. It had always been her sanctuary, her private refuge from the world. But it was there, beneath its heavy branches, that Thomas had laid bare his soul to her. She could still hear the hushed tremor in his voice as he spoke of his father's ambition, his guilt over how his family had acquired Willowbrook. He had been as much a victim of his legacy as she had been of hers. "Why couldn't he just ask me to stay?" she asked the empty room, though she knew the answer. Thomas had not asked because he too was a prisoner, trapped by the weight of his name, by the expectations that bound him as tightly as the estate's walls bound him to the land. A decision to make. The moonlight cast its pale glow across the floorboards, and as the night deepened, so did Eliza's sense of isolation. She had left Willowbrook behind, but had she left Thomas behind as well? Could she ever truly escape him now that she had seen what lay behind the mask he wore so carefully? Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, unwilling to give in to the emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. She had promised herself she would not look back, yet her heart refused to obey. It was not just the estate, nor the memories of her childhood that she longed for. It was Thomas, his touch, his voice, his presence. The man she had sworn to despise had somehow become the man she could not forget. Eliza stepped away from the window and sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap. The silence of the room pressed in around her, but it was not the comforting quiet she had hoped for. It was the silence of words unspoken, of chances not taken. With a heavy sigh, she lay down, knowing that sleep would not come easily. Her heart and her mind were at war, and in the stillness of the night, only one truth remained. She had left Willowbrook, but her heart was still there beneath the willow tree, waiting for something, waiting for someone. Chapter 9. The Willow Tree Reunion. The air was thick with the sweet scent of summer as Eliza made her way down the familiar path, her steps slow, her heart heavy with the weight of memories. The late afternoon sun bathed Willowbrook in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the fields. She hadn't meant to return, hadn't wanted to, but something had drawn her back, like the gentle tug of an invisible thread woven into her soul. She needed to say goodbye, one last time, to the place that had both shaped her and broken her. The willow tree by the river stood as it always had, its long weeping branches swaying gently in the breeze, whispering secrets only the wind could hear. Eliza paused at the edge of the meadow, her chest tight with a mixture of grief and longing. This tree had once been her sanctuary, a place where she had hidden from the world's cruelties, where she had dreamed of futures that now seemed so distant. But those dreams had been stolen, just like her family's legacy. Now all that was left was the ache of what might have been. With a deep breath, she stepped closer, her fingers brushing the familiar bark of the ancient tree. Her hand lingered there, as if the tree could offer her some comfort, some closure. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the river and the rustling leaves surround her. In this moment, she felt utterly alone, as though the world had forgotten her entirely. "Eliza!" The voice shattered her solitude like a pebble cast into still water, rippling through her with a force that left her breathless. She turned sharply, her heart pounding in her chest. Thomas stood just a few feet away, his tall frame outlined by the setting sun, casting him in a soft, golden light. His face, though usually so composed, was shadowed with emotion, an emotion she had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. "I thought you'd left," he said softly, his voice low, almost hesitant, as if he were afraid his words might scare her away. "I did," Eliza replied, her voice wavering slightly. She hadn't expected to see him here, not now, not like this. "I just came back to say goodbye," he finished for her. His eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on her, and Eliza felt as if he could see straight into her soul. "To the tree, to Willowbrook." Eliza swallowed hard, the words catching in her throat. "Yes, to everything." There was a long pause between them, the silence filled only by the soft murmur of the river and the rustling of the willow's branches. Thomas took a step closer, closing the distance between them, his gaze never leaving hers. "I don't want you to say goodbye, Eliza," he said, his voice rough, as though the words were being pulled from the deepest part of him. "Not to the tree, not to Willowbrook, not to me." Her breath hitched at the rawness in his tone. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to be here, asking her to stay. The Thomas Harrington she had known was proud, guarded, and impossibly distant, bound by the weight of his legacy. But the man standing before her now was none of those things. He was just a man stripped of his defenses, his heart exposed. "You don't understand, Thomas," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "There's too much between us, too much history, too much hurt. I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened." Thomas's eyes softened, and he took another step toward her, his hand reaching out to gently touch her arm. "I know," he said, his voice quieter now, as if he were speaking only for her. "I know there's been pain. But Eliza, I don't care about the past anymore. I've spent my entire life trying to uphold something I never wanted, a legacy built on pride and power, but none of it means anything to me, not without you." Eliza's heart raced, her mind reeling with the intensity of his words. She wanted to believe him, but the scars of the past ran deep, and the fear of being hurt again was still too fresh. She pulled away slightly, shaking her head. "You're asking me to forget everything," she whispered. "To forget what your family did. To forget the loss I've felt every day since Willowbrook was taken from us." Thomas's hand dropped to his side, and for a moment he looked lost, like a man who had fought a long battle and didn't know if he had any strength left to fight. But then, with a sudden burst of resolve, he stepped forward, closing the gap between them in a heartbeat. His hand cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "I'm not asking you to forget," he murmured. "I'm asking you to forgive. I know I can never erase the past, but I love you, Eliza. I've loved you since the moment I saw the fire in your eyes, the way you never let this place break you. I've been too proud, too afraid to admit it, but I'm not afraid anymore. I love you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it to you if you'll let me." The words hung between them, raw and unguarded, filling the space that had once been defined by distance and silence. Eliza felt her heart swell with emotions she had fought so hard to contain. Grief, anger, but also something else, something brighter, warmer. She had tried to hate him, tried to keep him at arm's length, but the truth was that she had been falling in love with him piece by piece from the moment they had first crossed words. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head slightly, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know how to forgive, Thomas." His fingers tightened gently around her face, his voice soft but steady. "Then let me show you how." In that moment, something inside her broke, something hard and brittle that she had clung to for so long. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch, allowing herself to feel the depth of his love and the truth in his words. When she opened her eyes again, she saw not the heir to Willowbrook, not the man whose family had taken everything from hers, but the man who had offered her his heart, raw and unpolished. "I love you too," she whispered, the words tumbling from her lips, fragile but real. Thomas exhaled as if he had been holding his breath for a lifetime. His arms wrapped around her, pulling her close against him, and for the first time, Eliza felt the weight of the past begin to lift. They stood there beneath the willow tree, their bodies entwined, their hearts finally unburdened. It was not a perfect love, not yet, but it was real, and it was theirs, and for now, that was enough. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the world in hues of pink and gold, they stood together, wrapped in the quiet promise of a new beginning, beneath the branches of the willow that had once been a symbol of loss, but was now the place where they had found each other.